Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Blaine Rada. What is exactly Camino de Santiago?
So the Camino de Santiago is a pilgrimage, which was a word that I had to actually find out what that really meant because I didn't grow up with any specific religious upbringing. So of course I'd heard of the word pilgrimage, but I didn't really understand what it was. But technically it's a pilgrimage across northern Spain that has been walked for over 1,000 years by millions of people, literally. Um, and the reason that it exists is that at the end of the journey in the town of Santiago, Spain, is a cathedral, and in that cathedral are the remains of the Apostle St. James. And so that's what people have been making a pilgrimage to for, like I said, over 1,000 years.
Wow. Why did you choose to take this walk?
So I first learned of it probably about 10 years ago. There was a movie that came out called The Way, starring Martin Sheen. And much of the movie was about this journey that he and people that he met along the way were taking. And it just sounded like one of those things when I first heard about it. I don't know if you've had this experience, Casey, but in my life, there's been a handful of times when I either hear about something or I learn something or I see something. And I just kind of say to myself at that time, I think I'm going to do that someday. I think that's a thing that, whether you call it on your bucket list or however you describe those lists of things that you want to get to someday, it was just something that I felt compelled to do when the timing was right. And so I didn't really think anything more about it after I had seen that movie and kind of got interested in the journey, knowing that the timing then wasn't right. And so I just kind of, didn't think about it for a long time. And then it kind of came back into my mind several years later. And I guess I didn't even really think much about why I was going until it got really close. I mean, I had to make these arrangements a year in advance. I had to look out into my calendar. And of course, this is, pre-pandemic. So, thinking back to what our lives were like before, I had to look in my calendar and try to find where's a big chunk of time that I could literally just disconnect from my entire life and have enough time to do this, because most of the experts that write books about this journey said that you should take at least a month, 35, 40 days is what you kind of need, which is a long time to be away from work and family and all of our normal responsibilities. So when I eventually made that commitment and kind of booked everything a year in advance and decided, okay, I'm going to do this thing, I didn't really think anything more about it until it started to get close. And then I really started to dwell on, well, why am I even doing this? And of course, everybody around me was asking, why are you doing this? Why would you walk 500 miles? It just seems like kind of an odd thing for someone to do. And I didn't have like a specific reason other than I wanted it to be a transformative experience. I wanted to come back a better version of myself, right? So whatever that means, better husband, better father, better coworker. I mean, I could make a list. I could make a list of all the things that I wish I could change or be better at, but I didn't really have a list. I just wanted it to be this transformational experience. I was open to whatever happened and was hoping that in whatever way possible, it would make me better. That was really my why.
So this is question number 2.5. So you have to, I'm assuming now that you're telling me this, I'm assuming you have to set up hotels along the way. Like, how does this journey work? Like, I'm
Yeah, so
picturing not walking.
there's as many ways to do it as there are people that do it. So
Okay.
I tend to my way, and actually doing things that are very physically challenging have been kind of a lifelong thing of mine. So running marathons or doing triathlons or uh, you know spending time in nature with no provisions. I mean, doing things that are like physically challenging have always been my way of learning more about myself. So I chose to kind of do this as traditionally as possible. And so what that meant was I didn't really have reservations, except for a handful of times. There are some larger cities that you pass through, and I wanted to take those opportunities in the larger cities to actually stay at a hotel where I could, get a decent shower or bath and have a nice meal and do some laundry in town and just kind of, and not have to rough it so much. But most of the time you're staying in hostels. And these hostels, I mean, they're every kind of hostel imaginable, from no running water, no electricity, to you feel like you're in someone's living room. They're really everything in between. And I chose not to make reservations because I didn't want to have to be confined to a certain amount of distance each day. I knew how much I had to walk to finish in the number of days I had, but I didn't want each day to be kind of a prescription of, oh, I've got to get to this spot, or I get to that spot and I still want to walk and I can't because this is where my reservation is. So I chose to just trust that there would be room. And there were times when there wasn't. I mean, there were towns that I had reached that I was planning to stay, and there was no place to stay, and I had to keep walking to the next town. But other people make reservations for the entire thing, and many people don't even stay in hostels at all. They stay in more, hotels or bed and breakfasts, or nicer accommodations. In fact, some people don't have to carry, and maybe they can't carry their pack. So I had a backpack of about 25 pounds on me. For people who didn't want to do that, or maybe couldn't, there are services where they will pick up your backpack in the morning and take it to where you're headed to that day. And so all you have to do is take with you whatever you might need for the day. And so there's just a lot of different ways that people can go about making the journey. But I chose, kind of the more traditional, rough it way, just because that's my way. That's how I do things.
So after you went through all of this, where did the idea come from to turn it into a book, to share your experience?
Yeah, so I really didn't have that as a plan. I think, like a lot of people, I've been intrigued by the idea of writing a book. If you ask most people, I think many would say, oh yeah, I've got a book in me, or there's something I'd like to be able to, put on paper for posterity, or and I just never, like most people, did anything with those ideas. Just, it was like someday I'll write a book. And I didn't even know what it would be about. Would it be about my professional life or the business I've been in? Or, so I wasn't thinking about writing a book about the Camino. Most of my work is speaking at conferences and events. And so I'm used to giving presentations. And one of the things that I was thinking about during my experience was, of all these things that I'm learning and experiencing, what are the stories and the lessons and things that I could put into my speeches, that I could put into my work. Still really wasn't thinking about it being a book. So when I came home, I had every intention of basically writing a summary of my experience. So, I've done a lot of traveling, and I've often at the end of my travels, written kind of a summary of what happened and where did I go, because family and friends and coworkers might be interested in knowing, and it's just easier to give them something in writing than to, have to tell the story 1,000 times. And so I gathered all the things that I had collected in terms of what had happened. So what I did during the journey was I took short little videos at the end of every day. So I basically did a selfie video at the end of every day, just capturing my thoughts and how I was doing and what was on my mind and how was I feeling and what struggles was I having, and just because I knew I'd forget. And then I made little notes. I didn't even journal. I didn't have time. So I just made little bullet points of, went here, did this, saw this. And I started putting all that together when I came back. And as I was writing, it just became this enormous project. And, I get to about 30,000 words and realize this isn't just like a summary of my trip. This is actually a story. This is actually a journey. And I think there are things in it that people, would find interesting or helpful or useful. And so I decided to use that experience as to kind of get myself into experiencing what it was like to put a book out there. And so I went through all the various challenges and questions around how do I publish, and what resources do I use, and how much do I do myself versus have other people do, and all those things that a first-time author struggles with, and just trying to figure out how to put a book into the world. Because there's so many choices now, right? It's so many ways that a person can create a book. And I wanted to go through that experience. I wanted it to be something that I would learn from. And so I just decided I would use that experience because I had enough information and enough of a story to tell to create my first book. And I couldn't be happier. I mean, it was in and of itself, it was a whole nother journey.
I know it's difficult, but just one thing that sparks your memory that you got from this walk, as far as one thing you learned about yourself that you didn't know beforehand, or something that made you see something differently in life. Just out of all the things you remember, what was the one thing the most you remember?
So there is one thing that I can point to. It's not probably as specific as some people would like it to be, but one of the things that happened to me during the walk was that I felt as if my heart was opening. And I don't really have a better way to describe it other than that I was feeling feelings and emotions, and even the thoughts I was having about things were at such a deeper level than is typical for me. I'm not a very emotive person, for instance. I have adult children who could probably count on one hand the number of times that they've witnessed me crying. And yet I cried every day on the Camino. And it wasn't always sadness. Sometimes it was joy. Sometimes it was, a beautiful sunrise. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons, but the emotions and the feelings, and even, even simple ideas like realizing how much we need each other. I mean, that's a very simple concept that most people intellectually understand. Yeah, we're all connected. We all need each other. I get that. The way in which I was actually like understanding that idea about needing each other was so much more intense during that experience. And I think part of it is, you're just literally getting stripped to the bone, to the essence of who you are out there. I was walking 9 hours a day. I was walking 20 miles a day. Many times I was alone for hours or had very little interaction, with people. And so there's a tremendous amount of kind of just stripping away of, all the things that normally define who I am, and all the things that I spend my time and energy thinking about and doing in my normal life. Those were all gone. I just walked. I got up in the morning, I walked. Eventually I stopped. And the next day I repeated. And that's a pretty simple existence. And when we kind of strip away all that other stuff that's normally part of our life and just focus on something so simple as just walking every day, it kind of opens you up in a different way. So of course the challenge in feeling like my heart had opened up and that I was really kind of experiencing feelings and emotions at a deeper level, the challenge was, how do I do that when I get back home? How do I be that same open-hearted person when I get back into the daily grind of emails and meetings? And honestly, it is a challenge. I mean, I'm different. I still cry a lot more now than I ever used to. I used to look at my wife, and we'd be watching something on television and there'd be a commercial and then it would bring her to tears. And I'd think, wow, she's just such a sensitive person that this commercial brought her to tears. Well, now I'm that person, that's crying at these commercials. So I kind of feel like the heart has remained open. But it is definitely harder to still have those kind of deep feelings in the razzmatazz of a busy life,
Right.
than it is when you're out in nature by yourself, for sure.
So is there anyone you would suggest specific, because you can say everyone should do this, but is there any type of person specifically you would suggest that at least consider taking this journey?
Well, certainly you're right in that, I wouldn't ever want to discourage anyone from doing it for whatever reasons they might object or say, oh, that's not for me, or I could never do that. I don't think that's true. I do think to get the most from the experience, you probably want it to in some way be a spiritual journey. I mean, some people might do it just because they like walking. Some people might do it with others because they just want to spend a bunch of time. I mean, there were two sisters that I came across from Australia, and one of them still lives in Australia, and the other one I think lives in the US. And they literally do this every year. They don't do the whole thing. They just take like a week or 10 days and walk however far they walk in that time. But they meet on the Camino once a year, and the entire time they're there, they're there for each other. That's their time to kind of bond as sisters, right? So that's a totally different reason. Ultimately, my definition of pilgrimage that worked for me was that it was a physical journey with a spiritual intention. Physical journey with a spiritual intention. So if I believe that that was kind of the definition that worked for me for what a pilgrimage is, then I guess what I'd say is that the people that that applies to need to be okay with the physicality of it, because it's physical, right? I mean, you can find ways to make it easier, but at the end of the day, it's a physical journey. And then again, I think if there can be some type of spiritual, or if people prefer the word religious, I mean, it is a Catholic tradition, you know, at its base. But obviously there's lots of people out there that aren't Catholic or aren't even, I mean, don't have any religious or spiritual practice, right? So that doesn't have to define why you're there, but I do think if you're at least open to it being a spiritual experience, you probably get a different experience than if you're just going for a long walk.